Hello boys and girls, friends old and new, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have this lovely Panda Mirexal chronograph. Pretty nice looking watch, but what the devil is that brand? Anyway, we see that the case has seen better days. Quite some oxidation and some marks. The dial looks pretty good actually. The pushers quite worn. Crown, I do not know whether this watch had a signed crown, but I doubt it. And the case back is in nice condition with some strange pattern of wear. But overall not too bad. And the watch is running and the chronograph works. So let's put it on the Timegrapher, which is a little bit of a mixed bag. This could be a problem with the lubrication, could also be a problem with escapement. We'll have to see. Valjoux 7733. We meet again. But this time the advantage is on my side, Mr. Holmes. Sorry, Mr. Valjoux. It is the Valjoux 7733. Pretty common chronograph caliber in a lot of watches from this time. So some of you might have seen the videos about my own collection, and this is actually part of that collection. It is a pretty recent acquisition, and the reason for that is actually because of the brand. The brand no longer exists. It was only in operation about 15 years, I think, from the late 1960s until mid-80s. It was a brand launched by Mirexal. For those who haven't heard of Mirexal, it's the biggest retailer in Switzerland. Also the biggest employer in the whole country, actually. And they sell all kinds of stuff. They have electronics, they have garden equipment. So yeah, like a big retailer. So Mirexal really wanted to have their own brand, which they then of course sold in their own stores. High quality at an affordable price. That is kind of what Mirexal is trying to do overall anyway. A store brand watch with a high grade caliber like 7733 inside. That's pretty cool. By the way, when we're taking out the pallet fork, we see there's quite a lot of power left in the movement, even though we did let the mainspring down. So definitely some dirt. That is to be expected. See, the chronograph bridge here is also a little bit tight. Have to be careful when taking it out. And interestingly, this little tension spring underneath the chronograph wheel is double. So someone did a quick one. They put in 2 springs there instead of adjusting the jewel, so we'll rectify that. The movement itself is in a lot of ways very interesting, I think at least. We talked in a few other videos about the manufacturers of movements, and especially the chronographs in Switzerland. There were quite a few, but over time there were also some consolidations. So, for instance, if you saw the videos on Venus, the Venus 175 inside the Juvenia butterfly dust dial, and then the Breitling Navitimer with the 178. Now we're going to briefly interrupt Grandpa's story time to look at this special tool we're going to use to take off the chronograph driving wheel. Now the chronograph driving wheel is friction fitted onto the extended pivot of the 4th wheel. And there's not always enough metal to press against for this tool, and that's why we use this little metal plate there. Nifty little trick if you need it. Oh, Grandpa, can you please continue the story? All right then, children. And then the wolf came out of the forest, and to his amazement, he found that Valjoux had acquired Venus. This was late 1960s. And the Venus movements we looked at in those two videos were the high-grade ones. By high-grade, I really mean column wheel or pillar wheel chronographs. And those are the ones they also were most famous for. But Venus also made more affordable chronograph movements, thus cam-shifted basically, like the 188. And after Valjoux acquired Venus, they basically just renamed the 188 the 7730. Now the Venus 188 and hence the 7730 Valjoux were actually a pretty old movement already. So the 7733 was a more industrial redesign. And that's why I find this movement interesting, because it is kind of a bridge between a traditional, beautiful horizontal clutch layout of the, let's say, older movements, and into then the more industrialized family of the 7750, for instance. You see there's very meager finishing. It's basically just sandblasted, I think. But it's, of course, sturdy, well made. So, yeah. It's a good caliber, but not the most expensive one, of course. While blabbering on, we managed to take apart almost the whole movement. We're gonna peg the jewel holes. We do that to take out any crusty and congealed lubrication. Quite a few people have also asked about this practice of taking the shock settings out before putting the watch into the cleaning machine. It's perfectly safe, otherwise I wouldn't do it. But if you don't feel comfortable, you can of course also leave them in and just take them out afterwards. Saves you a little tiny bit of time to do it this way. You see the mainspring looks pretty good, but completely dry. But we can reuse it. We're also using this Eve Flex stick to clean the pivots of the wheels. That is of course not actually polishing the pivots. That is something we'll have to do if the pivots are misshapen or very worn. But in most cases we would then just replace the wheel. Alright, let's populate the cleaning machine basket. It's gonna be pretty full this time as well. I philosophized a little bit about that before, but I think the main reason for human progress is laziness. If there's something we can invent to make things easier on ourselves, then it has a market. Laziness is the mother of invention. Anyway, let's get the parts out. We're gonna first put the mainspring back in. We use this mainspring winder. There are lots of versions of this tool out there as well, and most do the job pretty well, to be honest. What's important with a manual wind watch like this is that this little bridle at the end of the mainspring is aligned with that little notch in the side of the barrel that keeps the mainspring from slipping. With the barrel arbor in place, we can put a little bit of D5 or HB 1300 on the axis. And then we use this little barrel closing tool. For the capstones, we use Möbius 9010. You can, of course, also use epilam on the capstones. That makes it a little bit easier to put the oil drop in the middle. Alright, with the shock settings in place, let's see if the balance oscillates freely. And that looks fine. So then let's start rebuilding the base movement. The first wheel we're going to put in is the fourth wheel. And it's important we make sure that those spokes on the wheel are on each side of that little lip. Otherwise you might break the pivot. And it's the same for the 7734 and 36, of course. And now before we put on the barrel bridge, you might remember there was some play there. So we're going to have to take that out. And it's time for Hulk Smash! Hulk Smash! Or tippy tap, tip tip tippy tap, tip 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 tippy tap. So what we're actually doing is to compress the metal a little bit in the hole by using a domed anvil and a domed stake. And then that's probably not gonna fit, or it shouldn't fit even. So we're gonna use a smoothing broach to make the hole a little bit bigger again. And at the same time compress the metal a little bit so it becomes a stronger bearing. Now why wouldn't we just put a jewel in there? Well, mostly because we want to keep the watch original. A jeweled bearing would be better, for sure. For the escape wheel and also the pallet fork, we're going to treat them with epilam, or a fixer drop, as the product is called. And then we clean the pivots in pithwood, so there will be no residue of this epilam. Epilam is a stearic acid, so it's a little bit similar to stearine candles, like old school candles. So while we're putting the base movement back together, I thought I would pick up on a little bit of the comments and discussions that were around the radium watch that I published last week. A lot of very good comments, and thanks for that, of course. I hope I debunked some of the craziest myths about radium dial watches, but at the same time also made sure that people understand that it is dangerous, so you should not wear them 24/7, 365. But then again, most people who have old watches have more than one as well. But that's not what I wanted to pick up on. I wanted to pick up on a discussion around the future of wristwatches. And the question really goes something like this. Is there a future for wristwatches? Given that everyone nowadays has a phone and also probably some kind of fitness band or smart watch or that kind of thing. And I think the answer lies in that wristwatches are actually obsolete as a technology, and has been for quite a while actually. Ever since quartz watches became mainstream in the 1980s, mechanical wristwatches are more or less obsolete technology-wise. Quartz watches are cheaper to manufacture and they keep a lot better time than the most expensive wristwatch. And that was indeed part of the whole realignment of the Swiss watch industry. Yes, they came out with Swatch and that kind of stuff. But the reason you still have brands going very strongly today is because they have sort of embraced the fact that they are no longer real useful items. There are much better timekeepers all around you, so you don't actually need to look at your wrist to know what time it is anymore. There's a little bit of a joke among some watchmakers. If they're asked by a customer what kind of watch they wear themselves, they pull out their phone and say pocket watch. But as a luxury item, a wristwatch needs to be exclusive, needs to be attractive, of course, and needs to retain its value. Oh, here's FedEx.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
J'ai un colis pour vous.
Oui,
Comme ça.
merci beaucoup.
Voilà. Oui, pour les deux, ouais. Merci beaucoup. Bon après-midi.
Merci beaucoup. Bonne journée.
Au revoir.
No, I didn't keep that segment in there because I wanted to show off my stuttering French, but rather because it showed a good habit. If you're working on a watch and something disturbs you, make sure that you can immediately put like a little cheese clock kind of thing over it, so you don't get dust all over it. Anyway, we're on the keyless work side. We're gonna get that going, and then we're almost ready for getting the watch to run again. But as I was saying, the future for wristwatches, in my view, is very secure. Because if it depended on the technology, it would have already been wiped out. But that transition going from, let's say, an item you rely on to an item you don't rely on at all, but which shows a little bit perhaps of your status or your sense of fashion or your sense of exclusivity, that kind of thing, then your future can be very bright. Anyway, just my thoughts. I'll be happy to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's get back to the movement. We are lubricating the pallet stones, or rather the exit pallet stone. And then we're rubbing that off onto the escape wheel teeth, 5 at a time, because this is a low beat watch with 18,000 beats and 15 escape wheel teeth. And then we can put the balance back in, and always nice to see it start oscillating. Okay, let's give it a good wind. Then we oil the pivots. Use D5 HP 1300 for the center wheel and the third wheel, and then 9010 for the rest. All right. We see it runs much better. It's not the best line I've ever seen, but we should be happy with that. So with the base movement in decent health, let's start rebuilding the chronograph. So you probably remember that there were 2 of those little chronograph wheel tension springs. So we're gonna adjust the jewel setting a little bit in the chronograph bridge for the chronograph wheel. Use this Horia tool for that. Not a big adjustment needed, of course. But in watchmaking, the only things that are big are basically the muscles of the watchmakers. Anything else is quite small. We also put some oil on these heart-shaped cams. That is important because these are used to reset those counters to 0. So when a hammer hits those heart-shaped cams, they have the exact right shape, to be pressed back into the same position every time. They were actually sort of discovered by trial and error, but the shape is actually completely mathematically correct, so that's interesting. It's not a very intricate movement, and it's also very sturdily built. Perhaps more in common with the 7750 in that sense than, let's say, the more traditional ones. And whether it's a beautiful movement is also perhaps up for discussion. But then again, why would it really have to be, right? Display case backs is something that really only came in the 90s and in the new century or millennium even. It's not really applicable for this caliber. Now for the chronograph driving wheel, it needs to be flush with the clutch. So we're going to press it down first and then we're going to adjust it later. We're going to look a little bit more in detail at that. It is one of the trickier things with chronographs that if something is misaligned, then you're going to have to do a whole sequence of events in many cases. So if everything is working, you should never touch the eccentric screws, for instance. Let's look a little bit closer at the alignment in height. On the right side here we have the driving wheel, and on the left side the clutch wheel, and these are always in mesh when the watch is running. So of course if the driving wheel is much higher or lower than the clutch wheel, then you won't have good engagement. We're going to look a bit closer at the depthing between the wheels as well, but all in good order. Let's first get the hammer and the cam in place. And this operating lever spring is also something you probably recognize from the 7750. Very similar in design. Now one thing you might have seen is that, as I've done in other chronograph videos, I put the screws back into place after taking the chronograph parts off. And then I just unscrew it and put it on the plate like that. So that's not really a good place to hold it where you're putting parts in, but that's alright. The operating lever itself can be quite tricky on this family. In the joint on the operating lever there's like 3 layered pieces that need to be properly intertwined. And there's also this little cutout in that bridge for the chronograph mechanism that needs to be lubricated. Otherwise the operating spring might not be able to push the lever back properly. Now that's a lot more detail than most people need, but anyway, seems to work now. And by the way, Mark Lovick over at the Watch Repair channel, watchfix.com, has a really good chronograph course where he also uses this movement, or rather the Chinese clone of it, I think. One thing for the oiling, we don't lubricate the minute counter wheel because there's very little force involved, so we don't want any drag there. Now we're going to focus a little bit on the adjustment of the chronograph. And one common error that you might find in chronographs is when it all of a sudden stops just when the minute is about to move over. Like this. And the reason for this is that the little finger on the chronograph wheel down in the left hand corner here, if that finger that you see now butts against the teeth of the intermediate minute counter wheel, then the whole movement stops. So we need to adjust the depthing of that intermediate wheel with the eccentric screw. If it's too deep like this, then we might advance the minute counter 2 minutes instead of 1. So it needs to just bring that wheel with it 1 tooth at a time. The meshing between the driving wheel and the clutch wheel is also very important. If you look at down in the left corner here, it's a little bit too tight between them. Doesn't take a lot of dirt or anything to stop them. So we need to have a little bit more distance. They should mesh about 2/3 of the tooth depth. So that looks better. Okay, with all of this done, we are pretty much ready to put the dial back on the movement. The dial is very nice, good condition. Sorry about those meat sticks obscuring the view there. I have 10 of them. And they grow out of my hands like I don't know what. With the dial in place, we put on the minute counter hand. So we're just going to check that it resets as it should. And there, it flicked over. And there it reset. Can be tricky sometimes to line this up, so it's not uncommon to having to try a few times. Happens to me all the time. The hour and minute hand, the loom is a little bit degraded, but it's still pretty much intact, so we're not going to do anything about it. As viewers, regular viewers of the channel knows, I'm pretty conservative when it comes to what to do about watches. Probably more in the conservation camp than the restoration camp in that sense. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Let's just first check that the seconds hand and the minute hand both reset to 0. Yeah, that looks good. Now for the case is in decent condition. It's not in great condition as we saw. It has certainly seen better days. One of the results of this is what happens when we try to take out the pushers. It's the most common way of securing them with a screw that goes down into the pusher head. But sometimes, just sometimes, this guy Murphy comes into play. And what happens then is that the screws snap off. So we're going to have to deal with that. But first, let's clean the case a little bit. There was quite a lot of oxidation on the case. So we're using silver polish to take that out. The bezel as well is dark red and a little bit bluish, sometimes purple colors that you get on gold plated and sometimes gold items. It's easy to remove with these products. And then you get the shine and luster back. So let's put this in the ultrasonic. And then we're going to have to deal with the pusher afterwards. The ultrasonic is very good for cleaning things. To clean the whole movement there if you prefer, but the noise, man, the noise. And with the case slow cooking in the other room, we see that the pusher, we need to replace it, but the new pusher screw is too long. So we're going to go to our lathe And we're gonna basically cut off 0.8 millimeter off the head end of the screw. And then we lock the lathe in position and just use the graver to cross out or mark out the center of the screw. So we can use a slitting file to make the new screw slot. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. Alright, we're gonna put on a couple of new gaskets. Not that this watch will be watertight to a very strong degree anyway, but we might at least try. So I said I would come back to the case polishing a little bit. And let's start with this question. Why are there no gold-plated Rolexes? Well, the reason is pretty simple actually. You cannot really polish a gold-plated watch if it has any significant marks. And Rolex always polishes watches when a customer comes in with one. And if you did that to a gold-plated watch, you would rub off all the gold. Simple as that. So the only real option is to actually shine the watch up a little bit. Removing the gold and replating it is not actually an option. And the reason for that is that the plating on a watch has to be pretty thick. Let's say the standard for these watches would be 20 microns. And 1 micron, by the way, is 1,000th of a millimeter, so it's not really very thick anyway. But even 20 microns, if you want to replate the watch with that, will probably cost you a couple of $1,000 in the gold solution. And personally, I think an original vintage watch is more preferable anyway. Alright, before putting the watch on the wrist, let's check the reset. And that looks just fine. With a nice strap on it. The watch looks very nice, I think. Yes, it shows its age. But when I look in the mirror, I certainly see my age as well. And only my wife holds that against me. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will certainly help the channel. We'll be back soon with another video. Until then, ta-ta.